Hello, so we're back and we're covering Christopher Trogan's paper on Arthur Schopenhauer's 1818 book, The World as Will and Representation. So Christopher Trogan is living today out of, I think he went to Columbia, and he is writing this paper, Suicide and Freedom from Suffering, in Schopenhauer's Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung. In other words, Suicide and Freedom from Suffering in Schopenhauer's 1818 book, The World as Will and Representation. So let's just get a really complicated thing out of the way first. So knowing understanding Schopenhauer's will, we need to have a background on Kant's transcendental idealism and where the so-called thing in itself fits in. So, in other words, Kant was an idealist. So, an idealist has to consider this idea that the world only appears to us, and that is phenomenal. That is the way that the phenomenal world appears to us. And this appearance to us is known by perception. And it also has the key components, the key rational components of causation, time, and space. And so causation, time, and space are elements that are not brought by sense experience alone, but rather by reason. So in other words, the way in which we experience sense perception is by way of our reason. So that means that sense perception is agent dependent on our reasonable a prioristic understanding of time, space, and causation for Kant. Okay, and so if it is then agent dependent, it's otherwise known as ideal. Okay, but what the key is that there's always an outlier of the way that we're experiencing that we cannot access. So that outlier could be about things or ideas or just really anything that we cannot completely grasp with our agent-dependent cognition in terms of the phenomenal world. So there's always something that escapes the phenomenal world to the way that we understand things, because the way we understand things for Kant is agent-dependent, and that is something like what he terms transcendental idealism. So this so-called outlier is what he refers to as the thing in itself. And so the thing in itself is also termed a noumenon. So in other words, it's contrasted with phenomenon. So it's that which phenomena is not, which is the noumenon, okay? And so this noumenon is something that Schopenhauer takes up as something where he thinks, well, no, this is a misunderstanding of Kant's to think that it's a thing in itself apart from phenomena. So he's thinking it's a misunderstanding of the word noumenon to then Schopenhauer thinks that it should be taken, the word noumenon should be understood as that which is thought or an object of thought. So in other words, not necessarily an outlier, but something that is underlying phenomenal experience. So something that is underlying phenomenal experience is noumenal for Schopenhauer, in contrast to Kant. And so that is the thing in itself that Kant had. This is now the noumenon for Schopenhauer. And this noumenon is something that Schopenhauer identifies as will. So remember, the title of the book was The World as Will and Representation. So the representation there in the title is the phenomenal world, reference to Kant's understanding of the phenomenal world as appearing to us. So the world as it is represented to us is what Schopenhauer's keying into. And so then the world as it's represented to us has the underlying force of will, that is our drive to life, our will to life, that sort of thing. And that will to life is something that not only underlies our will to live, but also plants and animals, etc. Okay? And so this is, but it is unconscious as well. So it's an unconscious willing to live that is an underlying component of how it is that the world is represented to us in phenomena. Okay? So then now let's then take into account how Trogan is laying out Schopenhauer's view of suicide. So suicide as the possibility of achieving freedom from suffering through the denial of the individual will to life is something that Schopenhauer denies. Okay, and so suicide is not a way of freedom out of suffering. So in other words, suicide is a contradiction of will. So Trogan cites Schopenhauer's essay on suicide, and this essay starts out, and I'll link you to it, whereby Schopenhauer points out that Christianity holds that suicide is wrong because in life, suicide is a necessary end in life. So if we are atheists, then our goal to get into heaven is not an aim that keeps us from committing suicide. So in a way, it's starting to look like Schopenhauer thinks that suicide is something that is not necessarily a problem if you're an atheist. Yet suicide is not a release or a freedom from suffering. Okay, so how does he get there? So yet the will and the will to live are everywhere, not just observed in ourselves as humans. Plants and animals also have this willing, right? And so the endless striving of the will leads to dissatisfaction and disappointment for Schopenhauer. So know that this point, the endless striving of the will, the unconscious driving force, life force, leads us to dissatisfaction and disappointment. That is what characterizes Schopenhauer as the so-called pessimistic philosopher history knows him as. Some of you might know him as being one of the most pessimistic philosophers. That's the reason why. So, in other words, for Schopenhauer, suffering is essential for life, right? And so the will to live is really the equivalent of an acceptance of suffering. Yet, the fear of death is what is really stopping us from committing suicide, is what Schopenhauer is saying, aside from a Christian view or a religious view, because he's an atheist, okay? So Schopenhauer is a little bit like Epicurus, whereby we shouldn't fear death because we don't know what's actually going to happen when we die, okay? But we are still afraid. So 2 reasons why suicide does not free us from suffering. Trogan points out that for Schopenhauer, one is that death is not final annihilation for the phenomenal self. So that which is beyond the self is noumenal, which is the will, and is not subject to individuation. So this is key, that in other words, our individual lives are phenomenal. That's what appears to us is individuation. And so what the key is there is that the willing, though, that underlies that is beyond individuation. And so the idea that we're committing suicide to nullify that actually is a contradiction to that. Why? Because even if we kill ourselves, we still do not kill our noumenal selves, our non-individual selves, and the suffering still continues. And so what that means is you could really key it into this idea that people who are committing suicide still have after effects of the suicide, whether that be in their families or whether that be in the cleaning up of their estate and the problems that are resulting in having to deal with the so-called phenomenal self as it's related to the self that's non-individualized, which is still a suffering that is left over even after someone commits suicide. So that's key. And then also death has no meaning beyond the will. Death has no bearing on the will as beyond the self and beyond the physical phenomena. So will cannot will itself out of suffering simply because it's the death of the individual. So death itself doesn't go away, and likewise, just because you kill off yourself doesn't mean that you kill off the noumenal self, okay? That which, all the outliers that still are there even after you after you commit suicide, okay? So suicide cannot transcend willing itself. So nor can it transcend suffering itself. So we are left then with the question of the will. Oh, we are left with quieting the will by way of ascetic practices. So, in other words, the ascetic practices are a way of quieting down the drives of the will that we have, where the sufferings that we get are from this idea that we have an unwillingness to recognize the futility of the individual will against will itself. To free oneself from suffering is an illusion. So, in other words, the way that we understand the problem of death is that even when the body dies, we still are left with this idea that death is a negation of willing itself, because will itself still continues, okay? And so I think that that's a good place to stop, and we'll take it from there. So thanks.